So my first question to the round would be, as mentioned in the keynote, do you also see in the market that even before COVID there was indicators that the funding and the deals are decreasing and that the fintech hype is kind of over in a way? Astrid, what do you think?
So I wouldn't say that the fintech hype is over, because we see that fintech is rather seeing much more attraction also in areas embedded, where fintech is embedded. We see also areas in adjacent industries. You mentioned Koya, for example, in InsurTech. We see PropTech, for example. So it's a matter of course, as always, of definition. What we see is, and you mentioned this, that we see is a consolidation happening. So the number of deals might sometimes be decreasing, not only due to COVID, but we see that more funding is going into larger deals, for example. And this is, of course, also a sign for a maturing ecosystem. So if you take a look, how long can we talk about fintech? If I take a look at my personal career, I would say at least I work in the fintech space for probably 18 years, because if you take a look what's happening in the new economy and the dot-com crisis, many of these topics, if we take a look at PayPal, at eBay, there was a close fintech route. And this is, of course, something where new companies developed, where the whole ecosystem around this developed. So I think this is a very natural trend that we now see larger funding rounds for more mature business models, and to that extent also less deals.
Mahi, what is your experience, maybe also from a more global view?
Yeah, I'd like to start off with a caveat. First off, I was introduced, talking about FinTech Europe and so on. So I'll be basically sharing my experience and my opinion here, not that of Deutsche Bank, nor that of FinTech Europe. Having said that, I would like to sort of, zoom out a little bit, and in order to get a bird's eye view of the playing field back in January, at the beginning of this year. Forbes magazine, they came up with 5 big fintech trends, and inside that we had blockchain, we had hyper-personalization via big data and AI. We also had in there robotic process automation. We also had inside that group payments, mobile payments, innovation. And the last piece out of that bucket was conversational interfaces, aka chatbots. So what we can see out of those 5 big trends, some of them have really played out well between January and now. And the question is about funding. Of course, what we can say and what we have seen as part of that is that a lot of money has flown into fintech in general. Now, depending on which vertical we are talking about, there may be differences here and there. But I think what is really interesting and what's gonna, focus the interest of everyone going forward is the impact of COVID on the funding needs.
So there are different hypotheses towards COVID, if it's a booster for fintech models, or if it's in the short term have the effects that the funding and also the problems of the companies will go up. So Max, what's your view on that? What is the direct effect of COVID right now?
I think, and it comes also to the funding side, it has a multiple things you need to look at. On the one hand side, I will quickly comment on the funding side. I agree with Astrid. I think it's concentrating and going to different topics, and the effect of COVID directly on funding has been, in my personal opinion, a short-term effect when everybody was in panic around March, April. but now we're seeing it picking up again, and that the funding markets are almost back to normal. I wouldn't say normal because, of course, some of the investors were not able to fill their funds in the planned times due to the delays, but I don't expect that it will make a big difference. On the business side, I think the trend that the customer wants to buy something at point of sales, and Astrid mentioned that in the funding side as well, that fintech is no longer just number 26. It's more, can you add it to other services? Can you do non-financial services and add a financial services product to it? Is becoming more and more asked, and the usage rate spiked during Corona quite heavily. And I think this will have overall a very positive impact on the fintech market. At least we hope also, but I really believe that. And this is why we are at finleap are quite bullish on that, because infrastructure players such as solarisbank, such as Element, will become more and more important to help those non-financial institutions to offer fintech services.
So expansion is always a big topic for startups on the roadmaps. Right now, it's not easy to expand, also because of practical reasons like travel reasons. So, what is your impressions? Are fintechs postponing their expansion plans right now? Who want to?
You know, it depends, of course, on the runtime you have. And I think those fintechs, and this is a general statement for companies and how they are funded and set up, the longer your runtime is, the better you can plan, as always in life, right? And I see that companies in the fintech segment, which have a very clear view on which path they want to go, they will follow this path. And of course, we have much better opportunities today to set up, let's say, an overall European architecture in order to drive business, let's say, out of Berlin in many different countries. And this is happening. This is happening in a much easier way than it could ever be done before. So technology here helps again. Secondly, we talk about networks. So again, in our network society, today we have friends from Asia joining the summit. We have possibilities to connect with each other. Again, this is an area which helps at a very, very low cost. And of course, last but not least, Maxi mentioned the consumer base. Of course, there's much more, not only the B2C environment, but consumers, when they see there is a benefit, it doesn't matter where the company is located, as long as I can access the service. And these are very privileged key drivers in order to help expansion, even if we see, of course, an overall more difficult economic environment.
So Naoyoshi, what is your impression?
If you talk about fintech, we can't avoid the discussion on the issue of from the legal side point of view. So, for instance, if you compare with the German or European and Japanese legal side, so for instance, in Europe, EU, the PSD2 is already set in force, and we have already the slightly similar amended Banking Act 2017, but it's not an obligation to open API, but which is totally different from the European market. So I think that this kind of the barrier still exists between the EU market and the Japanese market. So if European startups would like to expand the geo-expansion to Japan, I think we should take into account this kind of the pain point. So, but of course we are one of the largest investor, and we actually support this kind of the side for the startups in the fintech area. So even though there is a lot of difficulty, but I think we could with the support of the VC or support of the large corporate, we can overcome this kind of the challenges.
So looking from Asia and especially from Japan to Europe, how interesting are the European markets for Japanese companies and for Japanese fintechs to expand?
It's a very tough question, but I would say that the fintech itself is in Japan is also the advanced. So in terms of the service, in terms of the customer demand expectations. So in this sense, there is not so much attractivity for the Japanese, let's say, for the investor. But in Europe, there's a kind of the different idea, different philosophy toward the financial service, which is quite makes, especially the investor or service provider in Japanese service provider is attractive, much more attractive. So probably this is our company strategy that we invest startups in order to adapt to this innovative technology into the Japanese market, so that we can create a kind of the synergy between so hybrid synergy, so to say, that between German and Japanese, European and Japanese technology. So combination. So yeah. So this kind of a direction we are still keen on finding out in Europe.
Astrid, you were nodding. So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think it proves that the ecosystem is so large that there is always complementary views. And I think this is the beauty about it. If you have a very mature environment, like you described for Japan, to seek then for opportunities in other fields in order to grow this further. And I think this is a very vital part also of upcoming fintech investments, to think about this type of complementary fit. We mentioned disruption as the overall theme for this panel. And this is where, again, disruption might come from if we bring in many different aspects into one new business model.
So, Max, you stayed in Japan for a few months to examine the market just recently. So what was your experience from the point of fintech?
I mean, for me, the first thing to figure out is that you can compare Japan much more to Germany than people think. Maybe on a fintech space, it's a couple years behind when it comes to the customer innovation. But generally speaking, you find conservative customers who are really traditional around banking services, which is not the easiest to convince them to switch to some kind of challenger bank or challenger offering in general. You have an aging population, you have low interest margin, you have a regulator which in effect is working closely together with BaFin on fintech regulation, so they exchange regularly and exchange experience. So I think the two markets are quite comparison. One thing which for me was very interesting to see, and I put it to the humbleness, but Naoyoshi-san knows it much better than me, of Japanese people. They talk down their startup scene a lot, but the scene is much better than people think. Although I think the big strength of Europe is the customer-centric thinking. So when it comes to holistic offerings across industries, the classical bank assurance topics, let's call it, it's very old school. It's not a combined offering, and SBI is probably the innovator in Japan on all these fields. So there is a big space for supporting. Nevertheless, Naoyoshi mentioned it earlier in his speech. I think to truly innovate, you need a strong partner of the large insurance companies, banks, or retail companies, because it is very costly to educate and convince people that they can trust in your system due to the traditional approach.
Can you think of maybe one or two examples how the people are using financial products different from Germany compared to Japan?
So this will kill my argument from earlier, but what was really for me one of the biggest innovation, and I was asking myself why we don't have it in Europe yet, is you can get a loan at the bank machine. So if you're running out of money, then you can directly apply for a loan. This for me is just exactly when we talk about customer-centric thinking is exactly the point where you need to go into. And this is why I'm saying they have good innovation in Japan. Then on the performance, personal finance management tools, on API banking, yes, it's harder than in Germany on PSD2, but with free money forward, money tree, you have really good players that know what they're doing, that pull data from the banks. It's just a very terrible process because you need to sign up all the banks. So the innovation in Japan is strong, especially on the process and tech side. And I think the difference to European enterprises, the willingness to change is higher, and the talks you're having with senior management of banks or insurance companies really go in the direction we need to change something, and we're happy to work together with young entrepreneurs to change something. Whereas in Germany, it sometimes takes a little bit longer to convince that you need to find an outside solution or an inside-out solution, let's put it that way.
So Mahi, if you talk to German or to European startups, how important is the whole Asian market as a place to expand, in your experience?
Yeah, I think Asia is definitely a very interesting place, not only for European startups, but for the entire ecosystem globally. As part of the work we do in the context of FinTech Europe, we have seen, for example, last year, a delegation that came from Singapore, which was led by a government agency. They brought several startups, to scout the DACH region here, which means the German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So it's vice versa. You also see a lot of startups out of the European region going into that direction. As Max was mentioning, there are definitely differences between the two ecosystems. And 2 weeks ago, I was on a call, and actually we had a leader from Facebook within the EMEA region on that call, and he was saying that when it comes to innovation, actually Europeans should be looking to Asia, not to the Silicon Valley model, because in Asia they have figured out the customer centricity Max was talking about, as well as Astrid, and we see very interesting business models coming out of that place. So back to your question. We have many things that we can learn from Asia. There are also things that perhaps could be interesting for them, seen from the West.
So one popular and one big example is Ant Financial, the big company from Alibaba, who's planning an IPO, but still is not in Europe or in the US and is focusing mainly on China. So what is your view on that important player?
Go ahead, Astrid. I mean, Ant Financial is definitely a very interesting player. No doubt about that. I mean, even yesterday we've seen with the valuation of Klarna, they're positioning themselves on that as well. So for me, what is really interesting when I look at that, in particular the Chinese ecosystem, we have those two giants, Ant Financial and WeChat, and they have succeeded in creating that infrastructure that helps, make sense of data and also use it. I think yesterday when you and I spoke over the phone, I also mentioned that in terms of POS lending, in terms of leveraging that data in order to offer products, they are really ahead of many regions regarding that. So it is, again, a very big player, and people are even looking at them as if it was, the role that Amazon is playing on the other side of the globe.
Astrid, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think this is an area where what you said about regulation plays a very important role. So currently we see, of course, the strong focus to China because the environment is completely different if it comes to acceptance of how to deal with personal data and other. So this, of course, gives strong push to the infrastructure and financial. And if I think about, okay, how to translate this into a let's say, European model in order to use this bridge from Asia to Europe. I think this is an area where regulation and how to set up an infrastructure which complies with the setup we have here plays a very important role. And this is one of the reasons why I think it might take still some more time in order to adjust this business model also going forward for Europe.
So your prediction would be that they, in the nearer future, they're not expanding to other continents like
I think they would be willing to, but this is opportunity cost, which you definitely have to figure in for your business case.
Mm. Okay. Naoyoshi, you want to add something? Or? Okay. So Max, Ping An, the Chinese insurance company, is also a shareholder of finleap, and you are planning together a European expansion. So what is the status of this right now?
I mean, generally speaking, Ping An for us is a great partner, similar to SBI, because they understand ecosystems and they understand platform. And this is what we are doing in Europe, that we don't see it as single silos who are working in future completely independent. We really see it as an ecosystem. We mentioned it earlier this talk that point of sales will become more important, and this is probably the vision going forward. So players like Amazon, like Google, like Apple, like Samsung, like Alibaba will play a more important role when it comes to financial services, but also others. And this is why, for us, both SBI and Ping An are role models and help us there to develop. And on the European expansion, I think we mentioned it earlier, right? We have the EU passporting. We can expand across the market. Nevertheless, especially now, I think everybody who is a prudent business person should still, even if the markets come back on financing, focus on where you can add the most value to increase your portfolio. And that's why it's a look of different ventures, right? If you look at solarisbank or if you look at Element, we will talk about different things on internationalization. And this is a step we will do across the portfolio. I mean, what is probably known that we are, from a finleap side, operating in France, Italy, and Spain today already. I think these will remain our core markets because the next big market would be probably UK, which is a bit more a tricky game, especially with Brexit. And then we need to see how we expand from there without expanding the footprint, just grabbing revenue out of these markets. And most of our ventures are going a similar route. And I think then also other markets outside of Europe can become very interesting, but probably once we know what happened after COVID, really.
Mm. So for the last 5 minutes, I want to come back to one of the interesting points you mentioned in the keynote, like the changing of banking more into a fun thing to do, combined with gaming, for example, and with social engagement. So for the other panelists, what is your point on that interesting development that player outside the financial industry are getting into the fintech and banking segment? Astrid?
First of all, I just wanted to add my short comment on what I told you. That actually the banking sector in Japan is, on the whole, quite struggling to make a revenue. So we are in terms of the regional bank in Japan, we are more than 100 regional bank in Japan, which is quite a lot. And currently, the Prime Minister of Japan has changed from the last 2 years, two weeks ago. And the current Prime Minister is the top priority. So political top priority is how to reduce the number of the banks in the whole in Japanese market. So I think it is a great pain point in terms of the regional economy. That the fact that there is a regional bank which cannot make a profit. So in order to change these negative circumstances, we put not only the governmental level but also the private economy level. We are pushing the regional bank to become these banks more attractive for the customers. And actually, it's related to the PSD2 that not only the banking actor, but also the large corporate outside the banking sector are very, very interesting to join to the banking service. So I think it's going to be the quite competitive market in next decades. In Japan as well as in Europe. So I think the point is that the survival the fittest. I think this is a quite appropriate terms if you talk about next banking business in I think the global. So yeah, I think that my talk is a little bit outside my the discussion, but yeah.
Maybe to add to there, I think we're not using the full potential of digital banking, for example, yet, because still on digital banking the offering is quite a very homogenic offering. So it doesn't matter if you're a woman, if you're black, if you're white, if you're young, if you're old. You get the same products. And with a digital platform, you're actually able to adapt the offering to the needs of the customer. A single dad, a single mom might need other products than a Generation Z person and so on, wants to have a different communication, wants to have it easier. And the solutions are more or less out on the market already. But to add and combine them in this right way, I think this will be a next evolution of banking where you really see a Generation Z offering and so on. Currently, I think because the market is, and I say it because if you could look to the overall market, is fairly small. But as soon as people move more to digital channels, this will be the next evolution.
But how do you see the chance of non-industry players to go into the banking segment and change the products?
Speaking, they will not do that without partners. I mean, Koya is doing it on the insurance side. We're doing it on Element side on the insurance side. Solarisbank is doing it very strongly on the banking side. If you offer a safe environment, let's call it, where you don't need to change your business model, you can approach a customer and offer them a bank. I mean, Solarisbank is probably the most mature in that field. You have Tomorrow Bank is running fully on Solarisbank, so meaning that Tomorrow Bank is an excellent offering, a very tailored to a specific audience bank, and they don't need a banking license. Maybe they get one in the future when they're very large, but they don't need to do that. We have with solarisbank, Bank, where you have Islamic banking in Germany now, which is also run by solarisbank, but the front end and the banking services and so on are done by So I think this is exactly where you need to see platform banks like SBI in Japan will probably be able to do an offering on their own. And then non-financial institutions will need service providers such as solarisbank to tackle this topic.
So Mahi and Astrid, what are your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very interesting topic. You know, going back to what I mentioned previously about those trends, we had that hyper personalization, meaning that big banks have understood that they have to walk that route, you know, as fintechs have been doing. And another point that I find interesting is the partnership between fintechs and banks. PwC came up with a study in 2019 whereby they said fintech banks partnership is a matter of strategic agenda for big banks, which means it is high on the agenda up there. And for banks, what banks do, they play offense and defense. That's the main difference between them and fintech. In terms of defense, they try to acquire new technologies, you know, to do that big transformation that they have to do in order to become efficient, in order to enrich their product offering. On the other side, they try to reach out to gain access to markets, new products, as well as new technologies. And that works for fintechs as well on the other way around. So it is definitely a very interesting topic. Again, if you look at the bank, originally it used to be like a big supermarket, you know, where you have lending, you have deposit, you have investment, and fintechs came, you know, it was this movement of unbundling that. You had fintechs that specialize on lending, some others in some other verticals. But Astrid mentioned something at the beginning of this discussion, which I find very interesting. It is this idea of fintech becoming now an ingredient. It's no longer a standalone kind of business, but now you see embedded fintech coming into play, which means that fintech is being to be part of several things that is happening inside the banking stack.
Thank you, Astrid. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, only to add, I mean, I think the main drivers we see in fintech in particular is on the one hand side, technology, demographics, and regulation. And if you combine this, you come to the topics we addressed already. So platformization, it's a tick in the box, right? Behavioral aspects and the frictionless, it's a tick in the box. And I think it's not only about, let's say, taking market share away from banks, where will be additional players now getting into banks' environments. I think there is a huge chunk of opportunities in addition to what we see today, because I think the transformative journey with regards to more efficiency of infrastructure, to additional services with regards to finance, these are areas which are not even touched. And this is where a lot of additional disruption will come from going forward.
And where you're searching for exciting startups. Perfect. The time is up. Thank you very much for the interesting insights. And I hope you enjoyed the panel. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.